In the last video, we talked a little bit about Rocket Lake from Intel, and today we're going to talk a little bit more about it, why it won't be worth purchasing, why it's doomed to fail, Tiger Lake, and more. YouTube channel Moore's Law is Dead and the Intel Microarchitecture Wikipedia page both point to a Rocket Lake leak, and that's that Rocket Lake is actually going to be using backported Willow Cove cores, which is Intel's supposedly 10 nanometer process node, or microarchitecture for a 10 nanometer process node, and they're going to be using the same microarchitecture but backporting it onto something called Cypress Cove, which is going to be 14 nanometer. So basically they're taking the microarchitecture from Willow Cove and they're using it in a 14 nanometer process node in the form of something called Cypress Cove for Rocket Lake. So that all sounds pretty good, right? Because Intel is trying to market it as Willow Cove, so it must be pretty significant, like the 25 to 30% boost that we're supposed to see in IPC over Skylake, but it seems highly unlikely that you'd be able to get a 14 nanometer chip to perform similarly to a 10 nanometer one on the same process node without pumping the voltage and the clock speeds, as well as the thermal limits, which are already high as they are. The 10700K and 10900K already outputs large amount of heat when they're overclocked to match some AMD chips in a workstation, and increasing those will just make the consumer have to pay more in the end because they're going to have to pay for a better cooler as well as better motherboard VRMs because these things are going to require more voltage. In the end, this will just mean a bigger cost for the consumer, and people will just look at Rocket Lake and Willow Cove in general and just kind of shake their heads, even though Rocket Lake isn't representative of Willow Cove 10 nanometer products because obviously Rocket Lake isn't on 10 nanometer. And this is kind of a pick your poison situation for Intel now. If they decide to go down the path where they claim that it's part of Willow Cove, either the performance is going to look really weak or they're going to have to pump up the voltage requirements, the thermal limits, and possibly the clock speeds as well in order to match the performance or get close to that of a 10 nanometer one, and even then it probably won't be very close. The thermal limits are already incredibly high, and increasing those would just make reviews even more negative. But then conversely, if you go with a weaker performance but keep the same thermal limits, well, then you have reviewers complaining about Intel's never-ending, lineup of 14 nanometer products and the nominal performance gains that we've seen since Skylake. It isn't technically wrong to call Cypress Cove part of Willow Cove because technically it is just a backported Willow Cove microarchitecture that's just on 14 nanometer instead of 10 nanometer. But from a consumer standpoint, that looks really bad because people expect things in the same microarchitecture to have the same process node and gate width, and have like the same features and quirks, so things like IPC, maybe clock speed to some extent, overclocking capabilities, etc. So it'll look really bad when Rocket Lake performs significantly worse than all of the upcoming 10 nanometer chips. Rocket Lake will be on LGA 1200, which means that Comet Lake users will have the option to upgrade to Rocket Lake, but I'm going to explain why it won't be worth it in any capacity. Well, first, for the reasons I mentioned above, you can either raise the clock speed, thermal limits, and the voltage requirements, which means that the end consumer is going to have to pay for a better motherboard and or a better cooler, which obviously isn't great because that means that you're investing more money into something that likely won't be supported after Rocket Lake. Or the second option is to leave all the things that I mentioned before as is, and increasing the performance through other means like improving the microarchitecture, in which case it won't yield a significant performance advantage to A, upgrade from Comet Lake, and B, wait for Alder Lake or just get Zen 3 from AMD. Now let's pause here for a moment and say the Rocket Lake leaks are real. Say they're real, and it's a full 25% IPC increase over Skylake, and you have similar or lower voltage and heat limits than what we have currently right now with Comet Lake. Well, that would certainly look really good on paper, right? Because you're getting a significant performance advantage and the same or lower thermal requirements, so you don't have to invest in a pretty expensive motherboard. Well, actually, you still do have to invest in a decently expensive motherboard. It's going to be at least $200 if you'd like to overclock, as well as getting a cooler that can actually handle the heat output and overclocking capabilities of these chips. But Intel aren't the only ones in the CPU space. Zen 3 looks to be pretty promising, and there just isn't a feasible way that Rocket Lake would be able to beat Zen 3 in terms of overall value or even value at a specific need. There is pretty much no reason to buy Intel now, and Intel has nowhere left to run and hide. Alder Lake has to be a success or Intel will not have had a relevant CPU in at least a few years. But I do think that Alder Lake is going to be a pretty good release, and I'll tell you why. It's because of Tiger Lake. Tiger Lake is a 10nm mobile lineup that will feature true Willow Cove cores, so no backported to 14nm or whatever. And the graphics and the benchmarks look to be pretty promising. The graphics are using the new Intel Gen 12 Xe graphics, which I actually covered, which Intel's, I think, planning to release their Xe GPU sometime this year. And the CPU will be available in 9W and 25W configuration for the overall CPU, so for the overall processing unit, so for both the CPU and the GPU. With this, we could really see some competition again in the CPU market, which is really good. If Tiger Lake is going to be a success, well, then we can really only assume that Alder Lake is just going to be even better, because it is just a refined 10nm process node. Alder Lake will also be the first desktop chips to feature Intel's Big.Little implementation, which is usually seen in ARM processors, where you have some lower power cores handling lower power tasks, and then higher power cores for the more high power tasks. Currently, Intel actually has these in their Lakefield CPUs, which I believe have launched or are going to launch pretty soon, which feature Sunny Cove cores for the more intensive tasks and some Tremont cores for the less intensive tasks, except for Alder Lake is going to use Golden Cove cores and Gracemont cores respectively. I will make another video on that because that is a really interesting topic, and I do think that is going to be the next big thing in the age of CPUs. For now though, look away folks, Rocket Lake looks to be a huge disaster, doomed from the start. Tiger Lake is really what you should be watching and is a lot more representative of what Intel can offer for their later CPUs. Alright, that's it for Intel Rocket Lake leaks. If you did enjoy, thumbs up, down if you didn't, subscribe for more, and let me know in the comment section down below what you think of these leaks.